Good morning, Professor Kent Lee here. Welcome back to Advanced English Conversation. First, let's talk about administrative details. First, I am putting these videos up on YouTube primarily. The LMS only has a certain amount of space for all these video files, and I've had a lot of problems uploading video files to the LMS. It keeps choking on my video files, and I keep having to redo it and redo it. I'm having better luck lately with YouTube, and also again the LMS is running out of space for all these video files. So I'm just going to put them directly on YouTube and then link them in the online lecture space in the LMS. I'm also going to chop these up into smaller files, into smaller videos for the sake of this class, because I teach two different sections of this class and they meet for different times and time periods, and it's kind of hard to match all the videos. So it's easier just to chop them up and say, okay, these two videos for Monday this section and these videos for Tuesday that section, and so on. So we'll do that. Another bit of business, the midterm. Okay, so it looks like we're going to be doing online lessons for a while. Not sure how long. That does affect the midterm, because usually I would do some kind of group presentation or discussion project for midterm, but that's not going to be likely. And just doing this online thing for a conversation class, well, it's very awkward and unnatural. It's kind of hard to do a real conversation class. So we're going to focus a bit more on maybe critical thinking skills in this class. That's kind of a theme of this class, critical thinking skills. And so for the midterm, if you're still doing online lessons up until the midterm week, I'll probably give you a little, maybe an individual discussion assignment for your midterm, where I'll ask you to upload a video in which you talk about something. I'll give you a question or questions to talk about, something that kind of has to do with the kind of ideas and contents we've been talking about the first few weeks of the course. And then we will, I'll have you upload a video file into the LMS in which you talk for a few minutes, giving your opinion about some kind of question related to this stuff. So I'll decide on the exact topic or questions for the midterm as the time approaches, and it looks like we'll still be doing online lessons by then. A lot of universities in Korea are doing online lessons until at least the beginning of May, as far as I know. Probably longer, could be the entire semester. This is not ideal, but of course this is for public safety. So I think teachers and students around the world are in a similar situation. It is not ideal for teaching, especially for a conversation class. The best we can do is adapt this class somewhat. We can't do a regular conversation class. I can focus more on, well, what I would usually do, a conversation class that focuses on critical thinking skills. At least I can focus more on the critical thinking skills and improving your critical thinking skills, which is relevant to public speaking and conversation, especially if you're going to be using English for any academic purposes or business purposes or workplace purposes in your future. This is relevant. So I think it's totally justified to do this for an online class, because, I mean, what else can we do? So we're going to continue talking about popular misunderstandings. Depending on which section you're in, the Monday, Wednesday, or the Tuesday, Thursday, before this video or after this video, you'll see another video where I wrap up my discussion of pop psychology. So I've talked about misunderstandings of psychology last week. So now we're going to talk about misunderstandings about language. And since I'm primarily a linguist, this of course stuff I feel strongly about. So I've got a handout for you. I've got a list on the first page of the handout of some common ideas about language, especially English and English learning. This affects you. Many of you have had to learn English as a second language, unless you were lucky to grow up in a bilingual environment. So a lot of these, not all of these, but a lot of these might not be correct ideas. So I want you to pause the video. So it's this 1 through 10. The first one says English came from Latin. Is that true or false? And so on. So this first section, the first 10 items on the first page of the handout, I want you to pause the video and discuss these questions with somebody. Do you think these claims or these ideas are true? So pause the video and discuss, and then we'll come back. Okay, let's talk about these. First, English came from Latin. That's a common misunderstanding. When I ask my students, where do you think English came from? A lot of them say, well, it came from Latin. Not exactly. It's not entirely wrong, but not exactly correct. We'll talk about the history of English a little bit later this week, or next week if you have a holiday on Wednesday for my Wednesday section. Anyway, it actually came from Old German, a form of Old German, and I'll show you later. I'll prove to you. If you don't believe me, I'll prove it to you. I'll read some Old English from 1,000 years ago in the next lecture. It was influenced a lot by Latin, and Latin has had a great deal of influence on English since the 1600s, but not originally. Originally, it started as an Old German dialect, or a group of dialects, as an Old Germanic language. I'll explain that later. So English has largest vocabulary. This one is true. It has the largest vocabulary of any language in the world because of its complex history. It has taken vocabulary and other elements from a lot of different languages, primarily Old German, Old French, Latin, Greek, Modern French, Spanish, etc. And I'll explain how that happened later on, because it also explains why English is so complicated. About 2/3 of English is from Latin, especially academic English and technical English. Just like in Korean, about 2/3 of Korean words are from Chinese, especially academic and technical Korean. Kind of similar. So it has the largest vocabulary in the world. Now the average maybe educated adult English speaker, native English speaker, maybe knows, depending on how you technically classify words, probably would need to know 40,000, 80,000 or more words. It's kind of tricky actually what you call a word. Is accountant, accounting, accounted, are they all the same word or different words, things like that. You could easily need to know over 100,000 individual words if you're going on for PhD studies, for example, if you're a more highly educated person. A lot of those words are maybe words we don't use anymore. A lot of them are words that are used in special fields. So obviously the average English speaker doesn't know chemistry terms, a lot of technical chemistry terms, biology terms, and geology terms, and philosophy terms and such. There are a lot of words in the English language that are not typically used by even the average educated person, but they're there, and they give their language a great deal of expressiveness and variety. Learning English. Is it true that to learn English you need to memorize a lot? Just memorize a lot of words and rules? Is memorization an effective strategy? No. I mean, to some degree you have to do some memorizing. Now, there are times when you have to memorize vocabulary. For example, when you're taking a course and you have to memorize, for example, business English vocabulary or chemistry vocabulary. And also, when you first start learning a new language, at the early stages, yes, you have to do a lot of memorization. But when it comes to general English, for you at your level, it doesn't make sense to spend a lot of time memorizing rules and vocabulary from books or taking Hagwon classes that focus on memorization. because we have known for a long time in language learning and in psychology that just memorization is not an effective method of learning. Again, except when you're, certain cases like, a specialized course, or when you start learning a new language. But the problem with memorization is that it goes against the way your brain works. You try to push a lot of information into your brain, and it might work short term, like for taking that TOEFL test or TOEIC test, but after the test you forget it. And I'm sure you had to do a lot of that for the Sunung test, but after the test you forget it, because the brain is going to go, oh, what is all this stuff? And your brain is going to throw it away because your brain can't connect it with what it already knows. It's kind of random, disconnected bits of information. And so when you do that, you're not really learning English, you're just memorizing facts about English, but it doesn't really make sense to your brain, and your brain is just going to throw it away. If you want to learn English and improve your vocabulary, the best thing to do, number one, do a lot of reading. Expose yourself to a lot of reading. It is through a lot of reading, a lot of different kinds of reading materials that you can learn vocabulary. And number two, expose yourself to media materials, things like from educational stuff like TED Talks to entertainment stuff like your favorite films and TV shows. That is actually good for vocabulary learning. Experiencing words repeatedly in different contexts, that's what helps you learn. It helps your brain to learn words and how they're actually used. You memorize words from a book, you don't really know how to use the word. But when you encounter words in real contexts, in reading or in media materials, your brain can actually learn how the word is used. Motivation. You just need more motivation? Well, not necessarily. There are helpful kinds of motivation and unhealthy kinds. Helpful kind is if you are interested in something, you're motivated because you have a real interest in something. Intellectual interest, a social interest, a personal interest. And you're learning and you feel like you're learning, you feel like you're improving, and you feel good about yourself. That's healthy motivation, and that can help. Or if you are learning, say, English because, well, you're interested in business and English is a helpful tool for learning about business, and business is your passion, then that's cool. Those are healthy kinds of motivation. But for a lot of students, it's unhealthy motivation, like I have to do this, I have to learn this, I have to get good scores on tests, I need to get good grades, I need to get into a good school, I need to get a good job. It's kind of pressure or learning because you have to. And what do you do when you have that kind of unhealthy or negative motivation? You rely a lot on memorization or other things that are not really effective learning. So it's not like you need more motivation, you need more healthy motivation. At least a neutral motivation, like this is helpful for learning about other things. And there's a lot I could say. I could say a lot more about that, but maybe another time, because that's actually a complicated topic, motivation. Students need to be corrected when making mistakes. Do you feel good when teachers correct you a lot? Does it help you? Does it encourage you? Do you learn effectively? Well, not really. Sometimes, yes, if it's helpful correction. But a lot of times it's more like barking at you or saying you're wrong. You do need to it does help to make mistakes. I mean, making mistakes is not bad. You learn from making mistakes. So it doesn't help you if you're being corrected all the time or too much. It's kind of discouraging. So too much correction is not really good or helpful. Does learning English does it mean accepting or assimilating to American culture? I think sadly a lot of Koreans or Asians think of it that way because, for one thing, the education system here focuses too much on American English, which is not healthy. You should be getting exposed to a variety of different kinds of English. American and British and Australian, Canadian, those are all valid. It's a helpful tool for learning about world culture, and that's what it should be. For learning about world culture, and for learning about whatever things you're interested in, like science or business or art or music or literature or whatever, it should be a helpful tool. It shouldn't be just American culture. It shouldn't be that way. Is grammar the most important part of learning a language? No. There's more to learning a language. There's culture, society, social relationships, communication. There's business, there's vocabulary, there's word meanings, there's speaking and sound structure. There are dialects. So much to language besides grammar. Unfortunately, a lot of classes, and especially Hagwons, focus so much on grammar. It makes it boring. They make grammar boring, which it shouldn't be. Is grammar a bunch of rules that should be followed? This is where I, as a linguist, get angry when I see the way grammar is often taught in my country or in Korea or anywhere. The way grammar is often taught. It's taught as a bunch of rules that you have to learn and follow. Language is not like that. Language is dynamic. It's changing. There are different varieties like British and American English, and they change over time. And the grammar rules that you might have learned might be outdated or old or not correct. To me as a linguist, I don't think of grammar as a bunch of rules in that way. You learn rules in the sense of do this, don't do that. Don't do that with your verbs, or do that with your verbs. But if you don't, okay, you're going to get punished. It's kind of rules like, don't throw trash in the ground, or don't, or wash your hands before dinner and things like that. Kind of rules where somebody is telling you what to do or what not to do. And that's not how language works. As a linguist, our understanding of grammatical rules is different. I actually love grammar. It's fun, it's fascinating, because it's not just it's rules maybe in the sense of principles. These are principles that kind of describe how people talk, how people use the language. It's not rules like do this, don't do that. It's rules in the sense of principles of how people use the language, including more abstract psychological or logical principles, which you will learn about if you take more linguistics classes. Or it's more like patterns, set of patterns that have meaning. You learn the perfect tense like have, gone. You probably just learned rules about how to do it and what to do with it. But you didn't learn the meanings. What are the different meanings or patterns of meaning in real contexts? You might not have learned that because it's a meaningful grammar form. It's not just a grammar construction, but it's a form that has a certain meaning. It's a pattern that has a meaning. There's certain meanings to it, like something recent or something that's important to the now, something that's relevant. I have gone. I have gotten over my cold, or something like that. To become fluent in language, you have to learn it as a child. Is that true? No. You might learn about the ideas of Chomsky, but his ideas about how language learning as a child is different from learning language as an adult. I think that's often misunderstood in a pop psychology kind of way. It's not to say that you can't become fluent in a language later in life. It's just that when you learn as a child, it's different. The way you learn, the way your brain learns it is different. It's easier and it's more natural. It doesn't mean that you can't learn a language later and become fluent in it. It's just that the way you learn a language when you're older is different. It takes more effort, it takes more conscious learning, maybe classroom instruction, and learning on your own, and may take motivation and things like that. It's just different. It's somewhat different. And exactly how different that is, that's still a topic of debate and research. It's just different, and it's possible to become fluent. Last one here, studying literature is not practical. You'll never get a good job if you're going to major in English literature. Is that true? No, because what you learn from literature and humanities isn't just, how to analyze poems or how novelists use metaphor or things like that. From literature and other humanities fields, you learn critical thinking skills, you learn analysis, analytical skills, You learn social skills from studying literature. You learn about different people in different time periods. It develops your social understanding, social awareness, cross-cultural awareness, and your moral reasoning, moral thinking skills. You read Charles Dickens and you learn, how it is to be a poor child in London, at that time period, and how life was so hard. And it develops your moral skills and your empathy, your social skills, your emotional reasoning skills, your emotional intelligence. And these are skills that companies need. So whether you go for a company job or some other kind of job, these are skills that companies need. And also your creative thinking skills, creativity. If you can appreciate how maybe studying humanities develops those different aspects of your thinking and your personality, those are things you can talk about in a job interview. Oh, you studied English literature. Why do you want a job at this company? Especially if it's an international company where you're going to be meeting people, working with people from other countries and other cultures. Businesses will need people like you with those kinds of skills. So these are some interesting ideas. The next part of the handout, there's a little section about grammar Nazis. We talked about rules and maybe teachers who like to correct you a lot. Maybe you had a teacher who was a grammar Nazi, somebody who likes to correct people all the time, correct their English, correct their grammar and their spelling. Now, sometimes there's a need for that, certain kinds of things, but do you think that this is healthy? A person who's always correcting other people, is it healthy? Where do these rules come from? Does blindly following rules make you educated? Does it make you an intelligent user of the language? Is being a grammar Nazi really a good idea? And think about some of the rules that you learned. Were they correct? In the next section after that, there's some other items to think about, a few rules and patterns you may have learned or learned about. You might have learned, well, if it's informing like the comparative, like ER, like hot, hotter, colorful, more colorful, ER versus more, or the hottest versus most colorful, the EST versus the most. Does it depend on the number of syllables? You probably were taught a rule like that. It depends on the number of syllables. Is that correct? Well, I've got a few things to think about here, and are simple rules going to actually help you? Or the rules that you learned, are they really correct or helpful? So in the next section, I want you to talk about these rules and these patterns, and what do you think of these? Were the rules correct? The ones that you were taught, were they correct? Were they helpful? Did they make sense? Pause the video and talk about this. Okay, we're back. Just a couple thoughts about grammar Nazis. I don't know if you've ever known a grammar Nazi, but boy, they can be annoying and irritating. Yes, there's certain things that need to be pointed out. I agree. But somebody who's always correcting other people or insisting on traditional rules, many times these people actually don't know linguistics or understand linguistics. They don't know what they're talking about. It's kind of a blind faith in rules, but without understanding really the language of the linguistics, the linguistic principles involved. Let's talk about adjective rules that you learned. Well, you see here some examples. You might not know these words. It's kind of informal words. Glib. We don't say glibber. It makes no sense. Nobody would ever say that. No English speaker would say smugger, smuggest. We don't say that. They are one syllable though, but we don't do that. It's more glib, more smug. Most glib, most smug. That was the most smug comment I've ever heard. Why? What about clear? You can say clearer, clearest. You can also say more clear, most clear. Both are fine. Why? It's not really about the syllables. It's about, well, the language history. Most of you are Koreans, if you're taking my class, and so you have kind of a sense. Maybe you can't explain it, but you've kind of a sense about certain grammar forms in Korean that are pure Korean grammar forms, like which Cantor words like ge, hange, or something used with words that are from old native Korean words versus patterns, grammar patterns and vocabulary patterns that are from Chinese. You have kind of a sense about which forms you use with the native Korean vocabulary versus the Chinese vocabulary. It's the same in English. Most native speakers can't tell you, oh, that word came from Dutch, or that word came into English in the 1500s from Dutch or from German, or that's an Old English word. Well, I'll tell you about the history of English in a few minutes, but really the comparative superlative pattern, ER, EST, or more, most, depends really on where the word came from. If the word is from the Old Germanic, or Old German part of the language, we use the Old Germanic pattern, the Old German pattern, which is ER, a hot, hotter, hottest, blue, bluer, bluest. That's an Old German pattern. And if you study German, it's the same in modern German. And it just happens to be the case that most of these Old German words in English, from the Old German part of the history of English, usually are one or two syllables. They're usually one or two syllable words because of how the words came into English and how the language changed since then. It's complicated. Now we have a lot of old French words that came into English 1,000 years ago, and these are also kind of core vocabulary like the Old German words. So the Old German words would be really common English words. Teach, taught, is, be, have, hot, cold, blue. But also some old French words that came into the language a long time ago, 1,000 years ago. These feel pretty much just as core as, almost as much of the core vocabulary as English. For Korean, your core vocabulary are these old Korean words, as opposed to the words from Chinese words. So in English, short words that are kind of really core, basic, everyday vocabulary from Old French, you can go either way. I can say clear, clearer, clearest, or more clear, most clear. You can go either way. Now, if the word comes from a different language at a different time, if it came from modern French, if it came from Dutch, so glib and smug came from Dutch later on, if it came from Spanish, so in kind of colloquial or informal or slang English. In slang English, we say loco for crazy. Oh, he's loco. It's a slang term. In English, it came from the Spanish, so you say he's more loco. He's even more loco today. President, he's even more loco today. As the most loco president we've ever had in the history of the U.S. You know who I'm talking about. Okay, so because it's not from the old core part of our language, we would go more most. That's really what the rule is. What you were taught is probably wrong and not linguistically accurate, because your typical language teacher isn't trained in linguistics and doesn't know. That's basically it. Why is English spelled so funny? Again, we have words from different languages in English. Words from Old English and Old German and Modern German and Modern French and things like that. So the spelling patterns are complicated. It's crazy complicated. It's because of the rich history of English. Especially words from Old French, Modern French, Old German, Modern German, Spanish, Latin, Greek, and so on. Number 13, stress patterns. Object is a thing. Object is I don't like it, I object. I object to this object. Verb. So even though these are Latin words, they're following a stress pattern from Old English or Old German part of our language, where nouns have stress like object and verbs have a stress like object, just like subject, subject, and so on. In, what is it, D? B. Nation, national, the vowel changes, national, and then the stress moves, nationality. This is a Latin pattern where the syllable often goes on the second or third syllable from the end of the word. This is common in a lot of academic words in English. It's a common Latin pattern. I don't want to explain the Latin stress rule. It's really complicated. Take a linguistics class. Linguists don't fully understand it though because it's complicated. But anyway, that's a Latin stress pattern. We have different word stress patterns, like object, object, nation, national. English is a very stressful language, right? Next we have television. This is a Greek pattern. Certain scientific prefixes like tele and kilo have a main stress. Television, that's a Greek pattern. Not a lot, mainly words with scientific prefixes. But do we say kilometer or kilometer? Kilometer? When the word first came into English, we said kilometer. But now the word has become, and that's a Greek pattern, kilo. Stress there, that's a Greek pattern. Kilo is a Greek scientific prefix. But now we say kilometer, where it's adopted a Latin stress pattern. The stress is moved. So both are correct. This is that kilometer today is the more natural pronunciation in English. It's been Latinized, kilometer. It's confusing. Take a word from modern French, Renaissance. Well, actually, Americans say Renaissance. British people say Renaissance. And it's from the French word the French word is Renaissance. If you want to say the proper French pronunciation and impress your friends at parties, Renaissance. So the French stress pattern in English, complicated. So why is English so complicated? You've noticed English is complicated? Let's talk about why.